Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and I'd like to offer you a brief recap of the last lecture in this lecture series where I took on the Platonic teachings with regard to justice that come out of his great dialogue, Republic. Um, I actually started off, I think, by developing a little bit of context for the emergence of the Platonic Academy in ancient Athens as the first of the four great schools of antiquity. Um, and I tried to develop not only that context for the sake of a little bit of historical background, but also to draw your attention to the sort of important role that the Academy plays as a symbol of a larger philosophical debate about education itself. The Platonic Academy was a first of its kind. It was an opportunity for people, a community, to gather in kind of a safe place and explore some of the most entrenched assumptions of the cultures from which they emerged. And I think that the legacy of the Academy is really still with us. I mean, I'm speaking to you really in the context of academia right now. And, one of the questions that we debate these days is whether or not, higher education is where you go to get your training so that you can enter into the economy. And there's nothing wrong with that. As I said in my lecture, I think that's part of what we do here. But I would argue that when we put higher education and academia in the context of the emergence of the Platonic Academy, I hope you can see that it's possibly a lot more than just sort of going and getting the mental training required to find your own place in the economy. In some sense, it's the place where you go to think about the structure of the economy and the structure of society and the thoughts of your culture on the nature of reality and really related to this lecture series, we really get to rethink maybe in a systematic way, what we're trying to accomplish with our lives. And so in some sense, I think the academic challenge is not just what we sometimes call dismissively an academic exercise that you go through in order to get a piece of paper called a diploma so that you can get a job, or you get other pieces of paper called money. Again, that is how a lot of Homo sapiens survive in complex economic societies. But with that said, the academy, academia, higher education in particular, and in particular the general education phase of higher education, is an opportunity to really sort of get your fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality exploded, and then hopefully you get the chance to sort of think about how to put them back together, and in general just sort of develop notions of how to research ideas and what counts as good sources and good knowledge and reliable data, and what are the processes that lead to some of the most coherent and defensible thoughts. Through practicing these processes, maybe we not only get the chance to sort of engage in an individual philosophical experiment, but maybe we develop the abilities that would allow us to deserve the right to a vote. Now, I'm not trying to make it a simple equation of if you don't go to college, you don't have a right to vote. Obviously not. But in some sense, I think that education, particularly higher education, and the democratic experiment are very much intimately related. More specifically, the experiment in philosophical thinking that is sort of institutionalized at the academy and runs through to this moment right here, right now, that has a special relationship to the experiment of democracy itself. How meaningful is democracy if, some crucial number of the citizens, some crucial part of the demos has never awakened philosophically and is merely being trained to sort of take a place within all the existing structures? So I think that I tried to dwell a little bit on the Platonic Academy and its emergence. for that reason, and I wanted to recap that today. I also, talked to you in the last lecture in this series a little bit about the nature of the Platonic writings and how he chose to write in dialogues, and how in some sense I interpret that as a kind of a nod to the very notion of philia sophia, the communal-based nature of the search for wisdom through the interaction between different perspectives, hopefully through charitable dialogue. And then we focused in on the Platonic work, Republic. And of course, right on its surface, we can see that it's a work of political philosophy. But I developed for you this idea that if you wanted to have a kind of a mature and sophisticated political philosophy, there are probably some other questions that you need to think about, maybe even before you can decide on how to distribute the benefits and burdens of living collectively and cooperatively. And those deeper questions are ethical questions and metaphysical questions. And so I suggested, along with many scholars of Republic that are far more advanced than I, that in some ways the Republic turns on the central theoretical question of what is the nature of justice, best understood as the idea of what is the nature of goodness itself. Perhaps we could say, what is the nature of ethical goodness itself? And then the second related question of, is a just person happier than an unjust person? And perhaps if we reword that to add some breadth to that exploration, is the person that's concerned with ethical goodness and notions of goodness any happier than the person that is not concerned with that and doesn't pursue that in his or her life? And then we focused on, three major characters, the characters of Glaucon and Thrasymachus and Socrates, and the different answers to the two central ethical questions that we've just discussed there. Very briefly, Glaucon suggested that, maybe justice and ethical goodness is a compromise, that rational creatures who are sort of painfully aware of their own vulnerability and weakness enter into a compromise that we enter into with each other in order to avoid the likelihood of the worst case scenarios of existence, where we'd end up somebody's prey or somebody's victim or somebody's slave. And avoiding that scenario, because it's unlikely that we would, without any kind of code of conduct, have total freedom in existence. And so we make a compromise with other vulnerable creatures to live by a code of conduct, and that seems to make cooperative living possible. And that code of conduct basically amounts to our cultural notions of justice and ethical goodness. And I asked you to put a pin in that, because here's an idea that's going to very much be reborn in the modern. It will be an idea whose time has come when we start to study social contract theories in the modern age. But then Glaucon went on to, offer an answer to the second question, I should say, that not only is goodness or justice kind of a compromise, is it what we really want? Is it what makes us happy? And his answer through the Ring of Gyges myth is a kind of a no. Our nature is not such that inclines us towards goodness naturally. We are more inclined to want freedom. And so we want to be able to do whatever we want. And if we could be free from the judging eyes of others in society and free of punishment in society, we would not live as we do currently. Okay, so, there's the Glauconian answer. And then I also developed for you the answer of Thrasymachus, or what I'll call the Thrasymachus position. And that is that, justice or goodness is really most fundamentally kind of a lie. It's kind of an illusion, and it's created by the most powerful in society. And it is always an answer that serves their interests. And so the value structures, the goodness, the notions of justice that inform any particular society are ideas and beliefs that really serve the interests of the entrenched power structures of society. And, Thrasymachus is like, come on, wake up, smell the coffee. It's obvious that this is the way it goes. And to think anything else is naive. And, does justice or goodness make us happier? Well, if being sheeple makes us happier, if being cannon fodder in somebody else's wars makes us happier, if being pawns in a larger economic game that's really played between powerful parties and competing economies makes us happier, then okay, maybe. But in reality, the highest happiness in human existence would, for Thrasymachus's albeit cynical sounding position here, would be to see through the illusion of moral goodness and ethical goodness and justice, and to the point where you become the author of that so that it is serving your own interests. And, sort of injustice done competently at the highest levels gives us the greatest chances of getting whatever we want out of life. Okay, and so there's the Thrasymachus position reviewed. And then lastly, I turned to Socrates, and I said that the character Socrates presents the Platonic position, and it's a wonderfully creative kind of rethinking of the whole question. And so, Plato / the character Socrates says, look, I can't really tell you about my thoughts on justice if I don't give you some sense for the kind of creature I think we are. And here's that move that we've highlighted a few times in the lecture series, that it seems as if the mature and well-developed thinkers have grounded maybe political philosophy and ethics, and in some sense grounded ethics, their vision of a good life, in their metaphysics, their vision of a life. And there's kind of two important components of the metaphysics that must be developed, and that is, your vision of what kind of creature are we and what is the nature of reality. And then that would give you a chance at developing the ethical idea of how does a creature like us move through a reality like this successfully, and thus create a theory of a good life, as the ancient ethical philosophers were trying to do. And so we see that Plato's first move is to sort of drop off the question of what is goodness, the ethical question, and drop into the metaphysical question of what is the nature of humans in terms of our reality, which we might note, because this is his theory of the psyche, is really the foundation for what will later become social science and psychology or psychology in the modern age, when all this is reborn, when all the philosophical experiment of the ancient world is reborn and gives rise to what we think of as the modern world. And so he says, I can't give you my notion of justice or goodness until I give you a notion of us. And he gives us this notion of us in terms of ourselves as complex creatures, three-part creatures with appetites and with spirit and with reason. And then defining each, he goes on to talk about the four really important virtues of Greek culture: wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice, and develops each one of those in relation to his theory of the psyche, and goes on to sort of conclude that justice is this sort of umbrella virtue that is comprised of wisdom and courage and temperance, which is to say it is a kind of an excellence. Justice or goodness is an excellence of the self, which we cultivate through self-knowledge. Here it is again, know thyself. And through self-knowledge and self-understanding, we can find a way to turn the complexity of the self into a kind of a harmony instead of an inner discord. And justice or goodness really is this harmony that we create through self-understanding. And I find that a very provocative answer, in part because it's such a strange but clever reversal or change of direction from the Glauconian and Thrasymachus answers, which, as you may note, and I talked about in the last lecture, are built on the assumption that goodness is somehow a code of conduct imposed upon us from without, whereas Plato's position, echoing in some ways the virtue ethics of the Taoists, I think, which come out of a similar time on the other side of the planet. Goodness is really not about something imposed upon us from without. It is something that we generate through self-awareness from within. And that maybe even our notions of being morally good people sort of flow from the state that we create within ourselves. And, just to make sure we complete the thought here, in terms of the second question, is the just person happier? It becomes a kind of an obvious answer. What do you want? Do you want inner turmoil and strife and discord, divisiveness, because you don't understand yourself well? Or would you rather pursue self-understanding and have the opportunity to create a kind of a harmonious set of relationships between all the important parts of yourself? And I think, again, the answer should be fairly obvious, that almost all of us would prefer inner harmony and inner peace through self-understanding, should such be possible. And to whatever degree we can achieve that in some sense, much more than the power that is promised by the Thrasamachian answer, much even maybe more important than even the security and the possibility of prosperity that is often through the Glauconian answer. What do power and security mean if we suffer from inner turmoil? I'm not trying to deny that some level of power and some level of security are important in life. I'm just trying to, raise this issue and put it into a kind of a more obvious relief here. If we have inner turmoil, if we have inner discord because we lack an understanding of the complexity of ourselves and the way in which we might have greater harmony in ourselves, then we can be safe and we can have prosperity and we can have power, and none of it will mean anything. All right. So that's a recap of the last lecture in the series, and I hope you're doing well and I hope you're flourishing. I hope you find some inner peace through self-awareness.